to allow me to share the screen because now they say host disable participant screen sharing.
Yes, I just have.
So I do hope that you can see the slides now.
Yes, we can see them very well.
It's a rather long title. The presentation is not going to be very long though. I'm interested in this relationship between the classic project of analyzing or defining knowledge, which by and large is a project that started with Plato a long time ago, and has been developed in the analytic quarters in the 20th century. And the connection between that kind of reductive approach to defining and analyzing knowledge and to the program, which is known as the knowledge first approach, which all of you, I presume, already know that is Tim Williamson's project. And I want to see whether or not expanding the notion of qualia from sensory, perceptual, and psychological qualia to a sort of more contentful cognitive or semantic qualia, in conjunction with validating the KK principle, would be a solution, would be a proposal, a fruitful proposal to link this kind of bridge between knowledge and understanding, between this kind of analytic approach to knowledge and the more phenomenological approach to knowledge. So in general, this is the general framework in which I'm going to express my thoughts and remarks. So by and large, the topics that I'm going to touch upon are the following. First, the analytic project of analyzing knowledge. Then I'm going to comment a bit on the fatal flaws on this project. And I'm going to say a few words about some Gettier counterexamples, insisting mainly not on the examples as such, which are very well known, but on the mechanics, on the reasoning, which is behind that kind of counterexamples. Then I'm going to give a very rough sketch of Tim Williamson's philosophy of knowledge, this knowledge first epistemology. And in the end, I'm going to say a few words about cognitive phenomenology, semantic and or cognitive qualia, and how the KK principle could be involved in creating this kind of bridge between knowledge and evidence and between knowledge and understanding. So this is roughly the plan of my talk, and I intend to speak for no more than 20 minutes or so, just to make room for comments and questions. Well, Plato's analysis, which turns out to be the classic analysis, the classic project, is very well known. And the outcome of this analysis is to point out that knowledge, especially propositional knowledge, is not a simple state of mind, is something composite. At least part of the composite construct, which is knowledge, is something external. The truth of a sentence and the justification. And there is also another more basic state of mind, which is component part of knowledge, and that is the state of belief. So according to this analysis, if we consider this relational concept, the agent X knows the proposition that P, where X is a rational agent and P is a proposition or the content of a sentence, and if we ask the question, what does it mean to claim this for particular values of X and P? So we aim at a definition or at an analysis of the concept of knowledge. What we get, according to the traditional analysis, is the following conjunction of three conditions. Each condition taken by itself is necessary for having the relation of knowledge between an agent and the proposition. And the claim, the traditional claim, is that the conjunction of all those three conditions is a sufficient condition for having knowledge. Therefore, X knows that P is going to be considered equivalent, extensionally equivalent at least, to the following conjunction. X believes that P, and P is true, and X is justified in believing that P. So in very few words, this classic analysis of knowledge can be rendered via the equation, knowledge is justified through belief. So here you have this equation, K equals JTB. Knowledge is justified through belief. So the idea of this very simple and very nice analysis, again, was that the three conditions in the analysis were individually necessary. So in other words, X knows that P only if X believes that P. Then again, X knows that P only if P is true. And last but of course not least, X knows that P only if X is justified in believing that P. So unless each of those three conditions were obtained, we cannot claim that the rational agent X is in the possession of having a propositional knowledge. But also the classic Platonic analysis aims to establish the idea that the three conditions are jointly sufficient. So in other words, what should obtain is the following conditional. If X believes that P and P is true and X is justified in believing that P, then X knows that P. So those two conditionals, the only if part and the if part, are grounding this idea that knowledge is at least extensionally equivalent to the conjunction of a belief that P, of the fact that P is true, and also the fact that X is justified in believing that P. And this accounts for the fact that knowledge is identical to justified true belief. Now, for over 2 millennia, this analysis was not challenged. But a very serious problem for this traditional analysis of knowledge came from Edmund Gettier, who described what are nowadays known as Gettier cases. And these kind of thought experiments or thought up situations involving a particular agent X and a particular proposition P, described in such a way that they plausibly satisfy the three conditions of the foregoing analysis, but in which intuitively one does not want to say that X really knows that P. So in other words, Gettier was able to come up with very simple cases, very intuitive cases in which an agent, a rational agent, complied with the three conditions. So in other words, he complied or she complied with the idea that each condition is necessary, but nevertheless, putting them together in that conjunction was not sufficient for us to claim intuitively that the agent was in the position of some knowledge. Now, to understand Gettier's reasoning, we need a bit of background about his two assumptions. Actually, there are two assumptions which are very plausible. At least one of them seems obvious, and the other one is very plausible. The first assumption is that beliefs entailed by other beliefs, justified beliefs, are themselves justified, and this seems obvious. And the second assumption is that one can be justified in believing a proposition which is false. Now, if that actually sounds a bit tricky, I have to remind you the fact that, sadly enough, in many cases in courts, there is plenty of good evidence that the innocent accused is guilty. So there are actually real cases with very grave consequences in which we believe that we have a justification in something which actually turns out to be false. So based on those two beliefs, Gettier was able to come up with very simple examples. I'm sure that most of you know that examples, and this is why I didn't in particular want to focus on a particular case, But if you like, we can discuss later on at the Q&A session about some Gettier examples. But in general, the reasoning behind Gettier is given, the rationale behind Gettier's cases is given by the conjunction of those two assumptions. The fact that justification is closed under entailment, and this is the first assumption. And the second assumption, which is enough reasonable, is the assumption that we can have good justification for false beliefs. Now, Gettier's challenge to this classic analysis, according to which K equals JTB, has had a significant impact on recent epistemology. And the reactions have ranged from the optimistic to the pessimistic. Optimists, on the one hand, have attempted to tighten the requirement of justification, and the results have been mixed. So the optimists believe that if we add more conditions to the three Platonic conditions, and each of those conditions is necessary in itself, then we may come up with an explanans or with an analysis for the concept of knowledge, which is sufficient for claiming that an agent is in the possession of some piece of knowledge. But fact is that to each and every addition to the three main conditions that I pointed out, fact is that we could come up with some strengthened Gettier counterexamples, which shows that adding some epicycles to the classic definition is not actually enough, because anytime we can come up with a new kind of Gettier example, which is a counterexample to our reductive analysis. On the other hand, the pessimists have urged that we should give up altogether on what they claim is a misguided attempt to analyze knowledge as it cannot be built upon the notion of belief by supplying suitable extra constraints on what kind of belief is in question. So in other words, pessimists, and I'm going actually to deal a bit with Tim Williamson, which is more in this camp, in this range. The pessimists are going to argue that contrary to some prima facie counterexamples, knowledge is a state of mind. Even though the reductive analysis points toward the direction that knowledge is a composite state, part of it being a state of mind, and some other parts are external, are not internal state of minds, are external conditions. Nevertheless, the pessimists are claiming that the whole approach, which is motivated by this kind of reductive analysis, is on a wrong track. So let me now tell you some things about this project, Knowledge First Epistemology. Well, actually, this is more than a sheer project, because in 2000, Tim Williamson produced a wonderful book, a masterpiece of epistemology, which is Knowledge and Its Limits. The abbreviation that you have there, and I'm going to refer to that book using that abbreviation, is KAIL, for short, KAIL. So this book has had a tremendous impact on recent epistemology. And in this book, Tim Williamson argues for a revisionary, I would say even a revolutionary reaction to the equation K equals JTB. So in other words, the main idea of KAIL is to treat knowledge not as a composite object, not as something which is the result of a sort of summation of belief, truth, and justification, but to treat knowledge as a first instance, as a sort of mental state. And this is why the whole project is called Knowledge First Epistemology. In true reality, Williamson reverses the direction of explication of much, if not all, recent thinking and epistemology. And this is why I said that this program is not only revisionary, but also revolutionary. Thus, rather than treat other key epistemic notions, typically belief and justification, as basic, and then attempt to analyze knowledge in terms of them, Williamson treats knowledge as primary and elucidates other notions relevant to epistemology in terms of their relationship to knowledge. So the concept of knowledge becomes the central concept to our understanding of belief. It's not the other way around in the way in which Plato taught us to see the things. We are not going to analyze and to explain knowledge in terms of belief, but to explain belief and many other more important epistemological notions, keeping in the center of the network of those epistemic notions the concept of knowledge. Some very simple and rough examples. Belief, for instance, is that state which aims at knowing. In other words, is like the telos of belief. The telos of belief is knowledge, and mere belief is just a kind of attempting at knowing. To believe that P is to treat P as if one knows that P. Now, given the seemingly intractable problems which challenge the project of reductive analysis of knowledge, K equals JTB, that have occurred in the post-Gettier literature, the knowledge first program is becoming very plausible and attractive. By and large, there are 5 integrated themes or topics in this knowledge first epistemology that Tim Williamson is articulating in this knowledge and limits monograph. And there we go. The first topic is knowledge is a state of mind. I referred to that already. The second topic, the relationship between causal explanation of action and knowledge. It's a very important point to create a sort of unitary explanation for action and for knowledge. The third topic is this, metaphorically speaking, cognitive homelessness thesis, which has a sort of connection with Williamson's resistance or even rejecting of the idea of luminosity of some states of mind of ours. And I'm going to deal with that specifically in my last part of my presentation when I'm going to talk about semantic qualia, about this third topic, the cognitive homelessness thesis. The fourth topic is maybe the most striking feature of Williamson's account. Knowledge is evidence. In other words, the knowledge account of evidence, and eventually this results in this equation, K equals E, knowledge is evidence. And last but not least, we have the knowledge account of assertion. So in a very resourceful book edited by Patrick Greenough and Duncan Pritchard, we have some essays which cover all those 5 items which are the main contents of Williamson's book. And I'm going to rely my own suggestion and presentation on one of those essays. It is an essay due to Neil Tennant, in which there is a discussion about the possibility of expanding or enlarging the concept of sensory qualia to the concept of semantic qualia. So let me now cover what it might be the main part and the positive contribution or proposal for our discussion, for our workshop in my presentation. And this is this topic of cognitive phenomenology, and as a correlate to that, the topic of semantic and or cognitive qualia. So let me first give you some short quotes from Williamson from this book, Kale. According to Williamson, a cognitive home is a region of logical space in which, and I quote, everything lies open to our view. Then again, on the next page, 94, Williamson goes like this. In our cognitive home, mistakes are always rectifiable. We are not omniscient about our cognitive home. we may not know the answer to a question simply because the question has never occurred to us. Even if something is open to view, we may not have glanced in that direction. The point is that such ignorance is always removable. But according to Williamson, our condition, our lot, as it were, is that we are cognitively homeless. Although much is in fact accessible to our knowledge, almost nothing is inherently accessible to it. Okay, so this very appealing idea, prima facie, which has been fueled by various versions of internalist approaches to knowledge. And of course, the founding father of this kind of approach was Descartes. Okay, so this idea that we have a sort of cognitive home, that we have a sort of direct access to some luminous states of our mind, such that if we are in those states, we really are also aware of the fact that we are in those states. Okay, so this is an idea that Williamson is criticizing, is by and large rejecting. And he emphasizes this point, which is actually a sort of realist approach to knowledge and an externalist reaction to various brands and genre of internalist approaches to knowledge. So Williamson emphasizes the point that we are cognitively homeless. This is a very nice and very strong metaphor. We are cognitively homeless, although much is in fact accessible to our knowledge. So we might have this feeling that the states of our minds are directly accessible to our own thoughts, and we become right away aware of those states of mind, and those states of mind are transparent and luminous to us. In the end of the day, Williamson points out, almost nothing is inherently, and I would focus on that word inherently, which means essentially, constitutively, metaphysically constitutively accessible to it. So for Williamson, there is no central core of mental states. Central in the sense that if the state S belongs to that core, then whenever one attends to the question, one is in a position to know whether one is in that state. Such a state S would be a case of a luminous condition holding. And the condition C is luminous if and only if, and we see that on page 95 in Williamson's own words, for every case alpha, if in alpha the condition C obtains, then in alpha one is in a position to know that C obtains. I might be wrong in my interpretation, but this kind of condition C looks pretty much similar to the KK principle, according to which if someone knows that P, then he or she is also in the position to know that he or she knows that P. And the principle is dubbed KK because the capital letter K stands for the initial letter in knowledge, and KK means that we have an iteration of the epistemic operator knowledge. So the idea is, and let me just write down for you here, the whole principle, if K of P, then KK of P. And of course, we may add something which is going to remind us about an agent. If K, let's say sub A, agent that P, then KK A of P. And this is why the whole principle is called KK. So prima facie, it looks to me that this luminosity condition C is pretty similar to the KK principle. So in other words, if Williamson is not satisfied with accepting that there is something central in this cognitive home, then in some roundabout way, he is also going to reject, in the end of the day, the validity, the general validity of the KK principle. Williamson maintains that no proposition can be the content of luminous knowledge, with rather trivial exceptions. And that is very shortly pointed out in the beginning of the book on page 13. So with very rare trivial exceptions, no proposition can be the content of luminous knowledge. Mind again the fact that this argument is relevant for Williamson's position about knowledge, which again is a realist position. And this anti-luminosity argument counts also in favor of his anti-realist arguments. So being a realist about knowledge, he is also eager to develop a sort of argumentation against anti-realists, against the idea that all truths can be known. That is an anti-realist position about knowledge, that all truths can be known. Okay, commenting further on Williamson quotes, even though an agent A might know that P, it would not follow from that fact alone. Okay, so it would not follow from that fact alone that A would be in a position to know that A knows that P. Again, my free interpretation, no proposition occupies a luminous state because the KK principle is not generally valid. Now, I submit in conjunction with a central tenet in Neil Tennant's paper that I mentioned before, and I realized eventually that there is this kind of convergence between my own thought and Neil Tennant. In the beginning, I thought those things independently, but then when I looked up in Neil Tennant's paper, I saw that he has very nice arguments articulating the things that I have only an intuition about. So I submit that a thinker can have a cognitive home with the following condition. When the thinker is in a state of understanding with respect to any sentence that is meaningful for her, for the thinker, then the thinker indeed knows, or at least she is in a position to know that she is in that state. So roughly, the thinker knows that she understands the sentence. And I am wondering whether or not that is tantamount, that is the same to she understands that she knows. So whether or not we have this kind of commutativity of the two epistemic operators, knows that she understands and understands that she knows. That is something that I deem is important to explore further. And I am interested in exploring that line of argumentation further. Now, this brings, the way I figure the things, this brings into the picture the issue of cognitive phenomenology. And let's pay some attention to some other quarters of not very recent analytic philosophy. I'm having in mind G. Moore's essay on propositions, in which the British philosopher addresses the issue of some act of consciousness, which may be called the understanding of words' meaning. And Moore makes the following kind of argument. It is plain, and I'm quoting from G. Moore, it is plain that the apprehension of the meaning of one sentence with one meaning differs in some respect from the apprehension of another sentence with a different meaning. So this meaning apprehension, Moore claims, is a kind of cognitive phenomenology. But Moore linked this more to the phenomenology of sensory equality. Sorry for this pun upon words. So G. Moore linked this Moore, M-O-R-E, okay, the second occurrence of Moore. So G. Moore linked this more to the phenomenology of sensory equality. Because for Moore, the distinction between several cognitive phenomenologies is an intuitive given. So according to him, apprehension of meanings are just elements of, and I'm quoting again, a new class of facts, which I want, Moore wants to call your attention to. So for G. Moore, those are plain, are quite plain, are quite obvious. He doesn't give any argument to that. Now for the connection between knowledge and understanding, I submit for this important connection between the concept of knowledge and the concept of understanding, I submit we may need more than those Moorean cognitive phenomenology connected to sensory qualities. And the proposal is to go beyond that and explore a kind of phenomenology, including even qualia, related to what we can call semantic qualia. So semantic facts which have a sort of content. So it might be for some people preposterous to speak about qualia in relation to semantic, but the idea, the rough idea is that the sensory qualia is not the only qualia that we are aware of. I believe that there is one's cognitive awareness that we have for, I don't know, the logical structure of judgments. And I'm using here a very simple word, the word and in English, which of course should mean and we can give a sort of model theoretic definition for the connective and. And we have a sort of awareness of the logical judgment or structure of those logical words. If we compare, for instance, a simple pattern of reasoning, like for instance, P and Q, therefore P, okay, in contradistinction with P or Q, therefore P. The former pattern is valid and the latter one is not valid. And the more we know, the more we are immersed into that kind of language and that kind of rational dialogue, we have a sort of awareness of feeling, a sort of semantic qualia through which we make a distinction between those logic words, between and or in this case. So trying to speculate a bit more about that, we can claim that there is something it is like to be in a cognitive state. And those qualia are constitutive for one's understanding of a proposition that P. Those semantic qualia have nothing to do with one's sensory manifold. It is a kind of reflective awareness of the cognitive content. The contents may be empirical or mathematical. And this reflective awareness brings again into the picture the KK principle, since this principle governs the reflective knowledge. So the fact that sensory qualia are not required, for instance, by abstract mathematical knowledge, shows that the grasping with understanding of the abstract content of that piece of mathematical knowledge is linked with non-sensory semantic cognitive qualia. This may be a bit too far-fetched and speculative, but I would like to call your attention to the fact that once you are very much aware, and look, we come up with this word, aware, well, with the relation of awareness. You are aware of what is going on in a piece of abstract reasoning, okay? So you have that kind of aha experience, that kind of understanding. And the suggestion that I am making is that in order to get that kind of aha experience, that kind of understanding, which is on top of those conditions for having the state of knowledge, that extra bit that is going to give you this kind of aha experience is equivalent to applying the KK principle in that context. So it is very hard, or maybe impossible, to articulate all those intuitions about our aha experiences into words, but nevertheless, it is plain, as G. Moore puts it, that now and then we don't just know stuff, but we know it with a sort of understanding, which is governed by a kind of a KK principle that also enriches our cognitive phenomenology. So as I promised, I was going to stop after 20 minutes. I extended by 5 minutes my time limit. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm eager to get your comments, criticism, and question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Professor Mircea Dumitru, and I think that there'll be a lot of questions here. So if you'd like, by all means, please join me in thanking Professor Dumitru. And if you'd like to sign up for questions in the chat, that will be terrific. And we have a full 15 minutes, I think, for questions and answers. So, or if you'd like to raise your hand, and I could see that you'd like to ask a question that way. Let's see. No one yet?
Yes,
Let me,
yes, there is a hand
oh,
raised.
oh, please, Professor Elgin, we're all ears. I'm afraid we can't hear you yet. Professor Elgin, I'm afraid we can't hear you yet. You need to unmute yourself.
Here we go. A worry about making it the KK thesis is, don't you get into a problem about iteration then? Do you have to know that you know that you know that you know? And that seems problematic. So it might be that, I mean, I like the basic idea, but making it KK, I think, buys you the problems that standard KK theses have.
I knew those worries. If I may answer, so did you finish your question, Professor Elgin?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was aware of those worries, and for sure I am not satisfied with the psychological implausibility of the principle. For sure, technically speaking, if we start with this iteration, there is no principled way to put a stop to that. So in other words, there is a point beyond which it is completely impossible for me to psychological compute this kind of iteration. Know that, know that, know that, know, and so on and so forth. This is pretty much like the Gricean condition for grasping the meaning of a sentence, okay? Word sentences, the Gricean mechanism in which you have the same kind of iteration. But I guess we can circumvent that problem. We can put an upper bound or limit, and we can sort of refine the KK principle such that at least part of the motivation, the basic intuition that we have, that we get a sort of better understanding of something once we are in a position to claim that we know that we already knew something that maybe previously we were not aware of. So there might be a sort of upper bound of limit in which we can put a stop. And I was also thinking about something different, something complementary, a bit different, but correlated to that. There is a paper by Sol Kripke in which he defends a sort of analysis of the oblique account, Fregean account of meaning. And Kripke also is saying that we have to put a stop at some point. It is like a fixed point theorem in which if we go up with the iteration, everything is going to collapse to the lower level. Does it make any sense what I'm saying? So we can go technically higher and higher. But if we have a sort of fixed point theorem, after a given point, all the other iterations are going to collapse on the base level. So in sum, there are some technical ways to circumvent that problem, and also to stick to the psychological plausibility that we don't need too many iterations of the K operator.
One small follow-up. What about the top level? Wherever it is, you don't know that if you don't know that you know that. So the top level is going to become somehow weirdly anti-luminous anyway, is that right?
Well, we might not have a sort of a priori knowledge about the top level, about the upper bound. I mean, I'm not going to fix in an a priori way what is the number.
I didn't mean where the upper bound is. I meant for any particular iteration, you go a certain number of steps, and then you say, that's it. Either mathematically or psychologically, I can't go any further. So what is your stand with respect to the top of that hierarchy? Do you know it or do you not know it?
I don't know it. It might be, the boundary might be very fuzzy, very vague. And that could be in agreement with some other tenets of Williamson's approach, I guess, at a higher level, whether or not we can apply the concept of knowledge to those levels. But this is very nebulous to my mind. So indeed, it is something that I didn't think through. So it's very nice to have your questions and to think about those issues, both in technical terms and in more conceptual philosophical terms. But my intuition now is to say that I am not aware of that I am not aware of the upper bound. And that actually could be something that I learn while I am doing the process.
All right, thank you so much to Professor Elgin for the question and to Professor Dumitru for the answer. I can't help noting that Professor Stefanov also writes in chat, quote, one could perhaps even stipulate that KKKP is equivalent to KKP. Professor Dumitru, would you like to comment on that?
Well, if we go to epistemic models through modal logic, then we can have this kind of reductive law. If we interpret K as being a sort of necessity operator, we know that in S4, box P is equivalent to box P, okay? Because we both have box P only if box P, and for sure we have to have box P only if box P, because that is just the K principle, the K axiom, the Kripke axiom. So it might be the case that if we built into this kind of principle, the S4 model logic, then we have that kind of reductive law.
And just to add a quick follow-up of my own to Professor Elgin and Professor Stefanov's questions, I seem to remember that back in the day when Jaakko Hintikka wrote Knowledge and Belief, the point there when you had the point there when you had this kind of iteration was that one is in a position to know that one is in a position to know that one is in a position to know, etc. But here, it seems that the constraint is much more powerful once we consider semantic qualia. It seems as it's almost that what's at stake is whether there's a logical structure to the qualia in question. Whether, I mean, can that be iterated, or even if we could even have an iteration of one step with respect to the logical structure of the phenomenal contours of what we experience, that would be incredibly significant. Okay, so
yeah, so if I get you correctly, what you say is that this kind of interpretation is a bit stronger than Hintikka's interpretation, right?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And do you find any problem with that? I mean, you find that, or if you think at it in terms of semantic qualia, that could be a solution to the problem.
Well, it seems to me that it has both a limitation and an incredibly fertile outlook to it. The limitation might be, of course, that many of us are cognitively limited, and in some ways we're not going to be able to iterate, just as Professor Elgin was saying earlier. But the sort of upshot, the payoff, seems to be that if we get this kind of logical structure to our conscious cognitive experiences, that would be fantastic. I mean, if that's the case, that would be quite novel, I think.
I have to think about that. Yeah, thank you very much for that suggestion. But you know, the starting point for what I presented here, the main motivation was more or less a sort of pedagogical motivation, and most of you are teachers, are instructors. And I'm sure that you had this kind of experience. Well, we call it a high experience, in which we teach some stuff to our pupils, to our students. At one point, we can see some other connections, some other things. They were there already. We knew that stuff, but we are not aware of all those connections, implications, you name it. And at that point, what counts for our understanding of our awareness that we already knew something that we are not aware of? So that was actually the very naive way to begin this kind of research. And there are very, very important books in which the authors in the preface are explaining that kind of experience that they had.
Thank you so much. And I think we have another question from Dr. Radu Tulai. Radu, we're
He's a
listening.
PhD student in our program, Radu Tulai.
I am not sure if it's a good question, but it's just a little curiosity of mine. Do you think this cognitive home could be based on foundations of primitive concepts? I mean, we always have them in our minds, or we always have them in our sights somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
So
not sure.
I'm not sure that I understand fully your question, but if you want to say that we are
not homeless because we have primitive concepts, and those.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. So we are in a situation in all the time. So we have to have a sort of understanding of that situation, a sort of pre-theoretic, pre-cognitive situation, understanding of that situation. And we rely. I mean, I want to rephrase somehow your intuition, right? I mean, to get your point, to know that I understood your question. So if you ask me whether or not we have some primitive concepts, notions, in terms of which we want to make sense of many other aspects of the reality, then of course we have that. There is no point in our mental life in which we cannot rely on some primitive notions or concepts. And we may have this impression prima facie that those are luminous because we have a sort of primitive direct access to the contents of those concepts. And expanding upon that kind of intuition, we eventually we believe that there is this kind of state S which is luminous. And we generalize that kind of hypothesis. Well, Timothy Williamson is rejecting that view. So when he says that we are homeless, he says that there is no central state S, which is luminous. There is no core to that logical space. But he doesn't claim that in concrete situations, the pragmatics of that situation is not based on the fact that we are supposed to use some concepts.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I have this example I want to give. It's more like not a primitive concept, but I think it's like primitive reasoning. For instance, when we learn subtraction and addition in school, we go by examples, a lot of examples that later inform the other mathematical operations we can make. What do you think about that? And as children, I mean, this is universally applicable. All children who learn maths can reasonably use all the other operations and as more complex as times go by. What do you think?
Well, what I'm saying now could be empirically tested, so it's just an empirical hypothesis. It seems to me that addition is more robust from a psychological perspective, and kids can learn very easy addition. Subtraction is more difficult, more abstract, because if you have two numbers, m and n, m less than n, and you have to subtract n from m, then you have to learn first the number 0, and they'll go below 0, as it were. So it's a lot of stuff which is packed there. So it may be that psychologically and evolutionary, we are hooked to some mathematical operations in a more obvious way than to other operations. And there is no wonder that in the axiomatization of arithmetic, the addition is the basic function, right? And that also has a sort of psychological counterpart, I would say.
Thank you so much, Radu, for your question, and Professor Dumitru for your answer. I also see that there's a short comment in the chat from Professor Stefanov pointing out that aha feelings might have some associated second-order qualia. I'm speculating he might consider the qualia of surprise or phenomenal contrast or something like that.
Yeah,
so thanks so much.
Good point.
Thanks so much for that. And next up, we have a question from Stephen Grimm. Stephen, we're all yours.
Thanks, Andre. I know we have to stop soon, so just you can tell me when. Professor Dumitru, thank you very much for your talk. my quick question is maybe related to the last question. It's so couldn't we be mistaken about our grasp of concepts? So I often find this is the case with me. Like, I think I understand what it means to be a nominalist. Like at some point in my undergraduate career, that William of Ockham was a nominalist, and then I realized, I didn't really understand. And the light that we see go on in our students' eyes, sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not accurate. You know, Russell thinks that certain things can be like Russell's paradoxes show that we have some insight that we think is just certain, but it's not certain. So if the aha moments can be fallible, then maybe they're not luminous.
Right. Yeah, I fully agree with that. And this fact that we can revise even our feelings, our intuitions, shows that there is something which is contentful there. It's not only an attitude, it's something that we revise in the light of the fact that a content is different from the one that we thought that we had. So that, for me at least, is another argument in the favor that there is a sort of qualitative aspect of the semantic content and cognitive content. If you accept that there is a connection between semantics and cognition, then also there is a qualitative aspect, a sort of qualia aspect to the content as well. Yeah, that's a very, very important point. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I didn't think about that. The
Very
fact
good.
that we may be wrong even about those very basic intuitions that we have. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And we have a new question from David Bourget. David, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think we can actually distinguish between the feeling of understanding, or the ha-ha feeling, and phenomenal representations of contents. And these things actually are quite separate. I'll talk more about this in my talk, but they're actually completely different. And maybe understanding requires sort of experiencing certain contents, certain facts, but I don't think it requires feeling ha-ha. So that's just kind of a sensation that's different from the kind of phenomenal representation that you need for understanding. This may be a tweak that could be applied here.
Okay. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. So that may mean that there is a sort of second order qualitative aspect, the way that my colleague Stefanov put it in the chat. When we have the aha experience, it's an experience of an experience. Could that mean that thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have to call it second order. It's like the feeling of déjà vu. It's something similar to that. It's like what it feels like when things unblock in your head or something. Blood flow increases. Maybe that's what causes it. It's not really. I'm going to argue that in my talk. It's not really understanding per se. It's kind of unrelated.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Well, it's correlated, but it's not understanding per se.
So actually, your point is that I have to make a distinction between those two aspects that I lump together.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
It's fantastic to know, David, that you're taking that line, because there are other authors for whom I think aha moments are constitutive for coming to understand. And so there's going to be a debate about this with Professor Dumitru, and so that's amazing. Thanks so much, everyone. I will stop the recording now, and please join me in thanking Professor Dumitru for his talk.
Thank you for your comments.